Good afternoon. We've had 2 days of discussion here at BIOVISION on the themes it's chosen to focus on. We've heard a lot of experts offer a lot of expert views that have given us a series of precise diagnoses of the challenges that we've identified. Now, it's the chance to move beyond that accurate diagnosis of the situation and explore what forms of therapy, if you forgive me for using the expression, we might identify to deal with those challenges, to remedy those ailments in the availability of health for citizens of Europe and the world beyond. Of course, we all agree health everywhere is less than perfect. Health systems everywhere face big challenges. And of course, we all agree new ideas, new technologies, and the researchers and the entrepreneurs who make them possible can make some contribution to resolving those problems. And of course, we all agree innovation must be supported, that it needs collaboration, that it needs to be paid for. And we all agree that innovation has to be balanced with protecting safety and at a cost that's acceptable to society. But agreeing on that is fairly easy. What is more of a challenge is developing some ways of transforming agreement on needs into action that can meet those needs. And in this closing plenary session, we're going to try to identify how we can move from that situation where we know what the problems are to diagnosis, from diagnosis to some ideas of clear lessons for the way ahead in terms of a treatment. So to start the process, I'd like to invite Professor Michel Goldman to join me up here. Many of you already know him well. Briefly, he's chairman of the BIOVISION board. Come over here, Michel, thank you. First executive director of the Innovative Medicines Initiative, of course. He's now professor of immunology and pharmacotherapy at Université Libre de Bruxelles, and last year he founded the Institute for Interdisciplinary Innovation in Healthcare. So, welcome, Michel. Thank you very much for being here. And let us start by getting you to give us a snapshot, because you've been here for 2 days, I think rather longer than 2 days, of the key things that you feel have come out so far of our discussions on cancer, on digital patient, on humanities, and so on. What are the things that you will take away from this yourself?
I think that the first key message is about prevention. So we start by understanding that cancer prevention is key, that it can be done through vaccination against cancer induced by viruses, but also by other means, by changing our lifestyles and so on. And that's critical because if we want to ensure the access of patients with cancer to, the new very efficient immunotherapies, it's very important that we reduce the cost of cancer in general by indeed implementing prevention. Obviously, we heard about prevention by vaccines against infectious diseases. And there again, the message is the same. If we want to invest to develop new antibiotics for antimicrobial resistance, it's critical that we take advantage of the efficient vaccines. And there we have to improve the coverage of vaccines in our population, and there is a lot to be done there, which, and I will come back to that, relates to humanities. And then we heard about the digital patient. We heard how digital tools will facilitate the interaction between the physician and the patient, but also we heard how digital tools will facilitate clinical trials and will facilitate to take into consideration what matters to patients in the evaluation of drug efficacy. That's all about patient-reported outcome, which becomes so important. It's also about, looking at what is of value for patient and society in guiding the decisions by regulators and payers. And finally, I think that we learn a lot about what means patient centricity. Every stakeholder in healthcare is talking about patient centricity, and I think that what we discuss about humanities really demonstrate the need to consider behind, top-level science, clinical investigation, to consider other elements which are so critical for patients and for society in general. And as I said yesterday, I think that we have really to consider humanities not only in developing countries, as discussed this afternoon, but also in our own country. Because at the end of the day, the access to medicine, which was primarily a problem in developing countries, become now a problem in our own country. Just think about this costly treatment against hepatitis C of cancer. So these are the main messages.
Well, thank you for that. Going back to the point I was making when I made that brief introduction, how far are you able yourself to feel comfortable that we can make real progress? Where do you see that there are things that can be done moving forward on this? We've all talked about lots of the barriers. What about the areas that we can really move forward? What barriers perhaps have to still be overcome?
Well, I think that what is critical and what is currently changing is the way regulators consider the issues. And really, and I think it's an European strength, because the European Medicine Agency, through its executive director and the senior medical officer at TMA, are really taking the lead worldwide in developing the concept that regulators are there, obviously, to protect society, to be very careful about, drug safety, but also to take fully into consideration risk-benefit assessment. And this means that, we have to implement new forms of clinical trials. We have to adopt new licensing schemes. And I really think that the fact that regulators now take initiatives to really change clinical trial licensing schemes is something very important to overcome what I consider as, the most important hurdle so far.
Well, let's stick with that question of regulators and clinical trials just for a moment, although clearly I imagine I could push you to say there are other areas, particularly in terms of access to medicines in the wider world, where regulators' part in it is perhaps less important. But if we stick to the question that you raise of regulators and clinical trials, how do you view, you were running, obviously, IMI during its first years, and there you were dealing frequently with this, you've watched it closely. How far is Europe, let's stick to for the moment, moving in terms of making its clinical trials regime, regulatory regime, actually functioning? We've watched for years as it's been chipped and changed and changed and chopped, and every time the question remains as to whether it's got where it needs to be. What's your view of it?
My view is that the progress is much too slow. That's very clear. We have example, and actually, for example, there is the example of the I-SPY2 trial for breast cancer in the United States, showing that indeed adaptive trials can facilitate not only drug development for the industry, which is critical, but also will maximize the chance for patients enrolled in clinical trial to get an active compound. And I know that there are now, pilot studies ongoing, but I think it's critical that we move more rapidly. I really think that, in many situations, the classical approach, randomized placebo-controlled trial, is not efficient anymore for society, for patients, for industry. And I really hope that in the following year we will see indeed new types of trials. They start to emerge, but I think it's too slow.
This is a big ask. You said yourself yesterday, I noticed, there's a challenge when you ask people to move outside their comfort zone. And we all talk to a lot of regulators. Some of us, I think, in the audience are regulators. And we know that regulators, and indeed many patient groups and civil society organizations, are concerned about the idea of rejigging clinical trials. They're not so keen on adaptive pathways, or they see dangers in the shift to personalized medicine approaches and so on. Do you feel there's a risk here of people not being able to move comfortably outside their comfort zone?
Yeah, I think that's really the problem. You know, industries, especially the big pharmaceutical companies, are often blamed to be risk averse, which I think is also changing, but I think that risk aversion, you will see this, you know, in many other stakeholder groups, including regulators and including, you know, all those policy makers. And I think that exactly that's the point, is that people are afraid to move outside their comfort zone, and they are also afraid to be blamed if something is happening.
So
and
we need some solutions to that. I'm going to come back to you with solutions to that, but first of all, let me ask you just one more thing before we move on. We'll come back to some of these other issues that you've raised. When you were running the IMI, you had a budget, I think, of about 2 billion.
Yeah.
Now you've set up your own institute, the Institute for Interdisciplinary Innovation in Healthcare. You must forgive me for not remembering all of that precisely. If you had 2 billion now, what would you do with it?
I think that the key is really education and training of all stakeholders in healthcare, not only physicians and, you know, people from the classical medical professions, but you know, everyone involved in healthcare should be educated and trained about, you know, this new concept, this new approach, should learn to mitigate risk and to take risk. And I really think that this will take some time, but I think we should start now to move forward with new education program, not only in our medical faculties, in our business schools, and really that's what I'm really focusing on at this time through this institute.